you just summarize for us the meaning of your essay?
I think it's tricky to summarize in very short words, but I think the key is that people are limited. Everybody has their limits. And disabilities are just some examples of what those limits look like. But societies and even the church have not always recognized that. They've sort of seen had some idea of a perfect humanity then to which people with disabilities don't match. And I think that's an artificial view of the world, because all of us are limited. We're born limited, and certainly we die limited. And that is the world that both our society and especially our theology needs to understand. And it's an understanding of who we are that matches our Christian faith much better than an illusion of a perfect person.
Just a minute, I took my notes on my mobile yesterday. Okay, and why did you decide to write this article? What's the reason that moved you to do this?
Well, you can see that I am a person with a disability. I'm a disabled person myself. And I think that sometimes, I think the Protestants sometimes are a little bit ahead of us on this, but in the Catholic Church, we've only really started thinking about disability recently and what that means for our theology. And sometimes we see, and I've experienced sometimes, this view of people with disabilities as being somehow less than, or sometimes even worse. You see writings about, well, what does this mean that this person is disabled? What does this say about God? And sometimes we have images of God that don't really match the reality of the limitedness of all people. And so I have experienced discrimination, and I think we can see if you walk into churches, how many of our churches are accessible to wheelchair users? How many of our churches have resources accessible to blind people? How many of our churches are enabled so that people with hearing aids can use them more handily? How many of our churches are equipped with dim lighting or easy access for people who have autistic or neuroprocessing issues? I think we just need to ask ourselves the question to see the answers to that. And so even if we first need the language, the theological language to talk about theology, but then we also, and to talk about disability, but then we need to actually live that understanding in practice.
And do you think the Catholic Church is moving up in order to overcome the old vision on disability as a hierarchy?
I think it is slowly. I think that you see the Vatican's initiative on establishing a disability office within the Office of Laity and Family. There are very encouraging signs, particularly statements by Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, the latest encyclical. There are signs that this is happening. It is a very recent process, but it is a process which I think is gradually underway.
And do you see the same changes also, I mean, in the base movement, I mean, into the parish, between priests, in the seminaries? Is it changing also on the grassroots level?
At some levels, and I think a lot of that is going to change. Remember that we're dealing with a church that exists around the world. And so there are some signs of some movements in some countries. But I think that there needs to be a lot more done in terms of education, and in terms of understanding. We ourselves, of course, the church is coming through a whole lot of issues at the moment. It's trying to grapple with the aftermath of the abuse crisis, and it's trying to understand how the formation that we've had of our priests can lead to things like that. So I think we're slowly starting to ask questions which lead to the right answers about what does it mean to treat people and everybody with dignity from childhood to old age. But I think we're moving, and I think, as you say, we're moving from a view of church that saw it primarily as a hierarchy to something that sees it a lot differently. So you see, we've got the synod on synodality coming up. And I think gradually, I don't think it's going to be consistent. I think one's always going to be able to look at things and say, this is wrong, this is out of place. And when we see them, we must correct them. And it's difficult to know what the long-term trends are going to look like. But I think we are seeing signs that these things which have created a challenge to the church's prophetic voice are slowly being addressed.
Reading your book, I cannot think about a dear friend of mine who was a person with disability.
Yeah.
It was Franco Bonprezzi. And he said that people with disability must take the microphone and speak out in order to represent themselves and explain to the world who the people with disability are and what they want, what their rights are. Do you think it's important to go on this way? And what can people with disability do in order to represent themselves?
I think that's very important. I don't know if you, my Italian is very basic, but I don't know if there is an equivalent slogan. But one of the big slogans in English among the disability community has been nothing about us without us. And that has been, particularly in recent years, that's been something that's been very broadly shared and I think, and encouraging even recently now, far more. There are people who have traditionally not had a voice, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, who are saying, we too have a voice, a right to be heard, a need to be heard, and we deserve the mechanisms that encourage us to be heard. And I think that is key. But I think on the one hand, there is a shift and there's a need to have disabled voices heard in the conversation. But I think there's also a need to shift mindsets so that it's not this group of people who are disabled over here, that group of people who are not disabled over there. I think this is where our theology can talk very powerfully about how humans are limited and how we are all limited at various stages of our lives. And if you think about it, the baby who cannot speak, who cannot feed themselves on their own, the older person who might be in the same position. In many cases, there is I don't know if there is a term equivalent in Italian, but in English there is the term sometimes used in the disability community, TABS, or the temporarily able-bodied. So the people who don't see themselves as having a disability, but who obviously are limited in some stages of their lives and whose apparent ability is one short window of their lives. And so, but yes, it is absolutely important that the people who are discriminated against and who experience the fact that society takes account of some limitations and not others, need to actually say this. But I think it's also important to remember that disability is not a medical problem. We've often seen it in the so-called medical model, that disability is a medical problem, and if we can only fix it, then the person will be fixed. But in reality, disability is actually a problem of society, because it says, what limits will society not accommodate? And therefore, what limits will it leave people out of? I think the pandemic has been a great symbol of this, because it used to be said before the pandemic, well, we can't make allowances for people to work from home. That would be too expensive. We can't make allowances for you to study from home. You need to catch the inaccessible trains, the inaccessible trams. You need to struggle with the society and the risk of catching diseases outside if you're immunocompromised. Along comes the pandemic, and oh yes, we can make all these accommodations. Indeed, we have to. And that's a wonderful example of how the social model of disability has been proven correct, because when society has a will to address these limitations, it's quite capable of doing so.
Thank you very much.